Hey, thanks for tuning into another video. Today we'll be looking at this sort of Apple Dock inspired zooming navigation bar that, of course, by the actual Apple one. I've done have the magnification myself, but we're going to be building this one. Since I want to keep this video a bit shorter and more straight to the point than the previous one, I'm going to go ahead and link it in sort of chapters here on YouTube down below, where we'll cover first the intro, which I'm doing right now. Then we'll build it live in Webflow, sort of the HTML structure. Then I'll show you guys how to create this effect using CSS only. And after that, I'll go over the JavaScript approach that we used for the actual clonable, as this was published as a free resource earlier this week on Osmo, which is the thing that you're seeing over here. So if you're interested in any of those parts, go ahead and skip to those things and I'll continue with the intro. So as mentioned, this thing was published as a free resource on the Osmo platform, which is a thing that I'm building together with Dennis Snellenberg. And as a way to keep you all in the loop of what's going on, if you subscribe to the waitlist, we're going to give you access to a free resource or clonable every Monday, every week until we launch. So then you'll get an email in your inbox, like here's last Monday's one, that has this effect as a Webflow clonable or as a CodePen link if you're not a Webflow user. So if you're interested in that, make sure to go to osmo.supply, put yourself on the waitlist, and then you'll get those things in your inbox every Monday and the previous ones that you've missed so far, in case this will be your first one. Anyways, this effect I have originally built once for a portfolio of a good friend of mine called Bramnaus. Make sure to check out his website, specifically his designer's index, which is full of these cool resources. But that's not the topic. The topic is his bottom navigation idea, as you see over here. In case you're wondering how this works on mobile, as you see, we got a cool tile overlay menu, actually made from those same elements that are the desktop nav. We transformed them into the mobile menu as well. Just to give you guys some inspiration on how such a bottom nav could transform to a mobile nav. Anyways, let's start with the live build of this thing. So this is sort of chapter 1, the HTML build, where I've got this empty project set up in Webflow. So yeah, let's just dive into this. In the sort of section we've titled clonable, I'm going to put in a div that I'm going to call navwrap. Give it a position, shouldn't click too fast, of fixed, tie to all corners, put it on top of everything. I'm actually not going to anchor it to 0 on the bottom, but to something like 10 VH. So I just want to make sure that it doesn't cover my my buttons and my title here at the bottom. So this can be custom to whatever you want. Now I want the thing that I'm putting in, the sort of the bar, to be at the bottom, like here in the center. So I'm going to give it a flex wrap, align it to the bottom, and then just put in my nav list block. My nav list, and this thing is going to be a HTML nav element, and it's actually not going to be. I need to have sort of a nav inner element, which is going to be the HTML nav, and have a display of flex aligned to the bottom, and then this one is just not going to be an HTML nav element, but actually a list. So I just went too fast here. Since we're going to have a list of items horizontally, it's best practice to use an HTML unordered list. So I'm going to convert this thing to a custom element. And instead of using a nav tag, it's going to be a UL, which is the tag for an unordered list. And we're just going to have to make sure that we get rid of any inherent styling that it might have from the UL styling Webflow gives it. So you see that we have some bottom margin, which I don't want, and I don't want any padding around it. And now this nav list is going to have a horizontal direction flex wrapper. And in my nav list, I'm going to add another custom element, which I'm going to call... Why is it saying nav settings? I just want this thing to be a list item, li. Okay. And I don't want this thing to have the class nav list. My Webflow is bugging a bit. This is going to be a nav item. Yeah, I don't know what was going on there. But this is going to be a nav item, and this is the nav, the unordered list item. Sorry, hope you're still following along. This thing is going to get a horizontal and vertically aligned flex wrapper and a position of relative. Now, inside of this li, we're going to add our link block. And our link block is going to get the class of nav item underscore link. And this is the actual block that is going to be clickable. So if we check out the demo, we see that we've got the clickable block, but for example, our tooltip on top is not going to be clickable at all. Since similar to Mac, if you like hover outside of it, the tooltip is just there to provide contextual information, but it's not the actual part of the clickable link. Now let's see. Our nav item is also the element that's going to define the width of what we've got going on, and later on the element that will be transforming. So I'm going to give that thing a width of 5 EMs. And my nav item link is going to get a width of 100% of that. And inside of this thing, I'm going to add some padding. I'll do 0.5 EMs on both sides. So the actual content that we're going to put inside, let's call it nav item. I'm just going to call it logo for now. Don't even have to put this in a div, actually. But that's where my image is going to go. Let's start with Notion. Let's see. Reason for this horizontal padding is because I want my elements to have some space in between, but I don't want, whenever I sort of hover in between those elements, that the list thinks I'm not hovering any element, because then the pointer events would start to look really weird. I sort of want to just fluently flow it from one into the other, but I don't want my items glued together. So by adding some padding on the actual link block, I keep the entire sort of hover area. Like if I would duplicate a bunch of them right now, you see that I've got some space in between, but my link blocks, they cover the entire space, meaning that if I would hover from the right one in between the left one and the center one, sorry, I'm sort of making a mess here, but if I would hover in between, I'm always hovering a link. So I'll always have some sort of magnification, and it won't sort of weirdly glitch in between and cause for some jittering. Hence the padding on the actual link block itself. And now also inside of my nav item, I'm going to put in a div for the nav. Let's just call it tooltip. And that one's going to be positioned absolute on the top. Let's put it some padding on all sides. I'm going to give it some sort of white background, black text, already got. Let's put it really small text font size. And then in my tooltip, add some element. Let's just call it Notion. I don't want any margin on my paragraph. That's weird. All right, now just to be perfectionist, I'm going to add some border radius on my tooltip. So it kind of looks nice, maybe a bit more, 0.25. Nice, now it's nice and rounded. Let's see. Since I've added a display flex, aligning my elements to the center, my tooltip, even though it only has a position of 0 on top, I don't have to define any left or right, and it's still being centered, so that we can preserve the transform property for the actual CSS animation later on. So let's just go ahead and put its initial state here, that one that's currently going on when it's not being hovered. So it's going to be a opacity of 0, and it's going to have a transform of maybe 0%. And then later on, we'll transform it up and show its opacity. And I'm actually going to put the Z index at 0 and put my icon on top of it so that it sort of comes from behind the logo instead of from the top. And since we'll be animating this, I'm going to give it a transition on the opacity property and on the transform property. And we change the timings to 300 milliseconds, and then later on we'll make sure that it gets shown. And now there's one final thing that we have to keep in mind, is that this nav is going to be on top of everything. And now I'm clicking on my document here, and you see that I'm selecting the nav rep, but there's no way for me to select the logo or the link on top here. So with my nav rep selected, I'm going to set pointer events to none, and then just make sure that the actual nav item is going to have a pointer events of auto. And then if we want, we can then again set the nav tooltip to be pointer events none. So that this way we can interact with the nav item, which is going to be the parent of all our links. But once we hover outside of that, so maybe on top of the tooltip, it will still disappear since it's no longer registering a hover on the item. And I think that's about everything we need. So let's duplicate this a couple of times. I'm going to speed this process up. All right. Let's see. Let's collapse everything. Now we've got our HTML structure ready. And now let's talk about the thing that we'll be animating. So the actual element that we're going to change the width of on hover, and let's give this, for example, a class of hover just to test something out, is going to be the actual nav item itself. So if we give this thing, for example, a width of 7 EMs, what happens is that our nav item link, which has a width of 100%, nicely scales with it, but our tooltip is not going to be affected. Now, do keep in mind that animating the width and height properties of elements is not recommended because it triggers a repaint in CSS, so it's not really good for performance. But doing this with transforms, if I would, for example, scale this element up, it would not push the other items out of the way. So it's going to be a whole lot more complex, and this way we can keep it a little more easy to understand, and it's quicker to set up. So yeah, we're going to be changing the width of this element. So I'm going to remove the hover class for now and apply some transition over here. Let's add it to the width property. Maybe 400 milliseconds and a nice, maybe do ease in out quart or something like that, so that when we add the hover class, it nicely grows just like that. And what we're going to do is that we want this nav item, the one that is going to grow the most, but I want its siblings, so the one element next to it and element next to that on the other side, to grow a bit as well, but just a bit less than the main one. So we get this cool sort of magnifying staircase effect from the one hovering. And now this is where I'm going to start the CSS animation chapter. So if you're going to tune in for this one, because in the clonable that we shared previously, we had a JavaScript approach. So we would add a class called hover, and then we would add a class for each close sibling and a class for each far sibling. And that would just be set over here in Webflow, which I'll cover in just a bit. But I want to cover which I think is going to be the best approach, and that's a CSS only way. Now, recently, Timothy Ricks posted a really nice post on LinkedIn about some resources for sibling selectors in CSS, which I highly recommend you guys look into, because there are some really interesting combinators existing in CSS that you can use. So we've got child combinators, and the one that we'll be using in this one is the next sibling combinator. So it's a plus sign, allowing us to select the next sibling using CSS, because CSS natively cannot easily select the previous sibling. So the previous element in the list, it can only look at the next one, or it can go down in the DOM order, but it cannot look backwards or upwards. So that's what we'll be using. So with this knowledge in mind, so let's open up our CSS embed, this one over here, and let's find our nav item. So basically what we'll be doing is that the one that we're currently hovering, this is a CSS hover. We can just do it like this. We're going to set its width to 7 EMs. Now if I save and close, we see that the one that I'm currently hovering nicely animates to 7 EMs. But I want its siblings, so the one next to it, to grow a little bit. How do I do that? So with nav item selected, when I'm hovering it, I want to find its sibling, which we just learned is a plus sign. But I cannot leave it like this, because now what am I going to look for? I can look for the next nav item and then give that thing a width of maybe 6 EM. So now that I see the one that is next to it is going to get a width of 6 EM on hover. Now I specifically declared that this should be the next nav item element. You could write this for shorthand and use the star sign, which is the I forgot the exact name, but it's sort of the global CSS selector for everything. So basically anything that comes after it, you see that it'll still work and it looks kind of shorthand in the code. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to leave it to be the nav item currently. So I think it's a bit easier to read. So if we want to select the one that's even further, we can just copy this whole thing and then also copy the plus nav item. So what we're basically doing is that we're building on top of the previous one. So we found the next nav item, and then from that one, we're going to find the other next one. And we're going to give that maybe 5.5 to give it a bit less. If we save and close, we see that the furthest one is also growing. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to copy and paste a bunch more of these, so it's a bit easier to see. You see that currently I've got 3 elements growing. But we just learned in the combinators reference here that there is no way to select a previous one. So here we're going to have to think a bit differently using the new CSS has selector. So instead of sort of starting from the element that we're hovering, which is what we're currently doing, we're going to have to sort of start from the previous element and then sort of find the one that's being hovered. So the way that we'll do that is that we'll take a nav item. We'll take that one, and then we'll use the new CSS has selector, and then we'll look for a nav item that has a sibling that is currently being hovered. And then that one is the previous one of the one that we're actually hovering, you know? So you take your time to deeply understand this one. And then that's going to get the width of 6 EM as well. I see that my Webflow logo scales to 6 EM as well. So again, I'm going to find for a nav item that has a sibling that is currently being hovered, like a next sibling. So I'm selecting the previous one. Now, if I want to, I have to look at my cheat sheet here down below to see the previous one. And that actually looks like this. So the one that has a sibling, and then we're going to do a selector. But here again, we could do a nav item that has a sibling that's being hovered. So we're sort of, imagine that we're going to hover select. We're going to start from Notion. And it says, if you've got a sibling that has a sibling that's being hovered, then put your width at 5.5 EM. And if we save and close that, we see that we got the effect done. Super cool. And now we just want to make sure that our tooltip also shows up, by the way. So what we're going to do is we're going to say nav item on hover. We're going to find the, I forgot the class name, I think it's called nav item tooltip, probably. And on hover, we're going to set its opacity to be 1. And we're going to do a transform on, let's not do a 3D, 0 pixels on the x-axis, and transform it, say, minus 80% on the y-axis. We're going to save and close. And that was not the tooltip. It was just called nav tooltip, of course. And there we go. Now I see that 80% is not enough. Let's move it a bit more. And if you find that movement distracting, you can just already preset it to minus 120 here. And it's just going to change the opacity. Then you can just completely remove the transform from the hover state as well. But I kind of like that it moves a bit, but maybe not as much. So I'm going to preset it to minus 50 and then on hover to minus 120. So it's basically doing a minus 70% transform on that. So this is the CSS only way, which I think is the nicest. I believe the has selector has like really good coverage. So this is safe to use, I believe, cross-browser, but don't hold me to that. Do your own research as well. But yeah, this is all you need to create this super cool effect. And you can get creative with it. Now I'm going to sort of comment this all out, which I think, yes, it's the star dash thing. And I'm going to save and close it. And we're going to do the JavaScript approach, which is the one that we shared in the resource. So this is end of chapter 2. You could basically take this as it is and use it. And welcome to chapter 3 if you're curious for the JavaScript approach. I'm going to publish this thing now because in this project, I have got a Slater file linked up. So I'm going to open up my live build project that has my CSS selector still going on. Oh no, I do remember why. Let's see, put my live build, add my Slater file. And let's see, okay, if I refresh now on the left, I did also remove the hovering of the tooltip previously, which I shouldn't have done. But anyways, let's focus on the size changing. I'm not going to completely type this, but this is the code that we shared in the clonable. So what we're doing here in JavaScript is that we're registering every single nav item and putting that in an array called nav items. Later on, in a for loop, I'm going to say for each item, make sure that you register the index of each item, and then we're going to add some event listeners for both mouse enter and mouse leave, so the hover in and hover out. On mouse enter, I'm adding the class list of hover, and the reason that it's already growing is because in Webflow, for the test like 2 minutes ago, I already added that hover class. So we follow along on the nav item. I already said that in hover it should be 7 EMs. So that's what's going on here. I'm adding it on mouse enter and removing it on mouse leave. And the other part that's going on is making sure that we find the correct siblings around it and that we toggle their class accordingly. To keep my code dry, which means don't repeat yourself, and keep things readable and scalable, I've created a helper function called toggle class, in which we're going to pass in a couple parameters. One is going to be the index, one is going to be the offset, one is going to be the class name that has to be toggled, and one is going to be a boolean to whether add or remove the class. In this function, I'm registering a variable called sibling, which is the actual element that we'll be targeting with this function. And that sibling is going to be equal to the array of nav items. And then we're going to open up the array. I'm going to find the correct element. And we're going to do that by using the index, which is the thing that we're passing in here for each item. Basically, every item has a number. So if we're going to hover on the first element, its index is going to be 0 because it's JavaScript indexing starts from 0, not from 1. And we're going to add our offset to it. And the offset is what we're passing in here in our function. So for our close sibling, that's like 1 before it, our offset is going to be -1. Now in this case, I took 0 as an example, so there is not going to be a -1. But if we take the closest one after it, my offset is going to be 1. So basically, I'm going to have nav items, index 0, Notion is item number 1, plus 1. So my index is going to be 1. So on sibling number 1, technically number 2 in the list, I'm going to do a toggle class list. The class name that I want is the sibling close, which is going to be a class that is left to define in Webflow. And I want to add it on hover. So I'm going to say true. Reverse thing happens on mouse leave. I'm going to find that same element, the one after. I'm going to remove the class of sibling close. And this way I can add lots of toggle class functions for all of my elements to find the one that is previously previous, or I don't even know what to refer to that, the previous sibling of my previous sibling. Anyways, I've called it sibling far, and the one that is going to be the 2 steps ahead. So, and again, in the case of Notion, to target Slack here, it's going to be sibling far, and the offset is going to be 2. So the only thing that we still need to define for this is the 2 classes, sibling close and sibling far. So if we head to Webflow, we already have our class of hover. So we're going to say sibling close. We're going to make that, again, clicking too quickly, 6 EMs. And my class of sibling far is going to be 5.25. So barely any size change, maybe do 5.5. And then I'm going to remove these classes. I'm going to publish. Hopefully that won't take too long. And refresh here. We see that we've got the same functionality that we previously achieved with CSS only. If we check that out in action, maybe not as big as this. Open up my clonable, my nav list. We see that we got my nav items. And we see those classes dynamically changing as we're hovering in and hovering out. Now, the reason that you might want to choose for the JavaScript approach over the CSS only one is maybe if you want to do a lot more that's happening on hover of these elements compared to just a simple size change or showing a tooltip. If we're going to do those stylistic changes that we did before, we saw that we can perfectly achieve it with CSS only. We just figured that probably the JavaScript approach here was a little bit more clear as to what's happening by adding and removing the classes. So yeah, that sort of concludes today's video. If you would like to have the source code of this, make sure that you put yourself on the waitlist. Feels like I'm really shilling it by now, but if you do, we will send you an automated email that has a link to this clonable or CodePen already. And yeah, I hope that you find this useful. In the beginning, I said I want to keep this video short. I see that's turned into quite a long one anyways, but again, this time I did a proper YouTuber thing by adding those chapters, which I think will be very helpful, I think. Anyways, I'm liking to make these videos again, back on a regular schedule. So if you want to see more of these, make sure that you subscribe down below, so that you'll never miss one, hopefully. And yeah, see you in the next one. Cheers.